So, I've got something super exciting for you today on Faith Fuel Freedom, and I just can't wait to dive right into it. You know how sometimes we're all just looking for that divine guidance in our lives? Well, today we're going to explore something really, really important: how to actually hear God's voice in your daily life.
Oh my goodness, yes. And I'm absolutely thrilled about this topic because, it's something that's so close to my heart. Like, this is probably one of the most transformative things we can talk about, right? Because when you actually start recognizing God's voice in your everyday life, it's it's just absolutely game-changing.
I know so many of our listeners have been, really wanting to understand this better. And honestly, that's why I'm so excited to have you here today, Adrian, because you've got such amazing insight into this whole journey of, connecting with God's voice.
And the beautiful thing is, and I really want to emphasize this right from the start, this isn't some mysterious thing that's only for certain people. Like, this is something that's available to absolutely everyone. You know what I mean? It's just about learning how to recognize it and create that space for divine connection.
Adrian, one thing that I think really confuses people is, what does God's voice actually sound like? Like, how do you even know it's Him?
Oh, that's such a good point. And and I think there's this common misconception that God's voice is like, this big booming voice from the sky or something really dramatic. But the reality is, and this is so important, God's voice is usually much more subtle, much more gentle than that, right? It's like this peaceful knowing, this deep sense of certainty that just settles in your spirit.
So how do you tell the difference between, God's voice and maybe just our own thoughts?
So, and this is really fascinating. God's voice typically aligns with his character. You know what I mean? Like, it's always going to be consistent with love, with truth, with peace. And one of the biggest differences is that God's voice brings this incredible clarity that just cuts through all our mental chatter. It's like, when you're overthinking something and your thoughts are just going round and round? Well, God's voice is different. It brings this beautiful sense of peace and direction.
I've noticed sometimes people get really caught up in trying to hear this specific type of voice. Is that something we should be focusing on?
Not at all. And this is such an important point to make. God speaks to each of us in ways that we can understand, right? For some people, it might be through thoughts or impressions. For others, it's through that sense of peace we talked about. And sometimes it's through circumstances or even, through his word in scripture. The key is learning to recognize his voice in whatever way he chooses to speak to us.
So, once we understand what God's voice might sound like, how do we actually, you know, create the right environment to hear it?
Okay, so this is actually super practical. And I love talking about this because it's something we can all do. The first thing, and this is absolutely crucial, is creating what I call sacred space in our daily lives. And by that I mean, intentionally setting aside time where we're just completely unplugged from all the noise.
And like, turning off our phones and finding a quiet spot?
Exactly that. And you know what's really interesting? It's not just about physical quiet, right? It's about creating this mental and emotional quiet too. So, and this is something I've learned through experience. You might want to start your day maybe 15 minutes earlier, find a comfortable spot, and just be still.
That makes so much sense. But what do you actually do during that quiet time?
So there are different approaches, and what works really varies from person to person. Like, some people find it really helpful to start with deep breathing, just focusing on each breath, letting go of all the scattered thoughts. And then there's meditation on scripture, it's just incredibly powerful. You take a verse or a passage and you just let it sink deep into your spirit.
Do you have any specific practices that have worked really well for you?
Oh yes, and this has been such a game changer for me. I actually keep what I call a spiritual journal, right? And what I do is I write down my prayers, my questions for God, and this is the key part. I just sit quietly and write down whatever impressions come to my heart. It's like having this beautiful, ongoing conversation with God.
That's really beautiful. Do you think it matters what time of day we do this?
You know what? And this is something I really want to emphasize. It's less about the specific time and more about consistency. Like, some people are morning people, and for them, that early dawn quiet it's just perfect. But others might connect better in the evening. The important thing is, you're making this a regular practice, creating this daily space where you and God can just be together.
So Adrian, how do we actually know when it's really God speaking to us? Like, how can we be sure?
Oh, this is such a good question. And I love talking about this because God actually gives us these amazing ways to confirm his voice. You know, one of the first things I always look for is this deep sense of peace. Like, even if what I'm hearing is challenging, there's this underlying peace that just feels different from regular thoughts.
Can you give us some specific signs to look out for?
Yes, absolutely. So, and this is something I've experienced personally. God often speaks through patterns, right? Like, you might get this gentle nudge about something, and then suddenly you start seeing confirmations everywhere. Maybe in your daily devotions, or through a conversation with a friend, or even just these seemingly random circumstances that all point in the same direction.
That's really fascinating. How does scripture play into all of this?
Oh my goodness, scripture is it's absolutely fundamental in this process. And here's why. God will never, ever contradict his written word. So when we think we're hearing his voice, we always want to check it against scripture. Like, if you think God is telling you something and you find that same principle in the Bible, that's a really strong confirmation.
So, scripture's like our, verification tool?
Exactly that. And you know what's really amazing? The more time you spend in scripture, the more familiar you become with God's voice. It's like getting to know someone's writing style, right? You start to recognize the way they express themselves. And scripture helps us develop this spiritual discernment that becomes almost like a built-in detector.
What about when we're facing big decisions?
So this is really important. When it comes to major decisions, God typically confirms his guidance in multiple ways. Like, you might get that initial nudge, then maybe a relevant scripture jumps out at you, and then perhaps a trusted friend or mentor independently confirms that same direction. It's like God knows we need these extra reassurances for the big stuff. You know what I mean?
So something that's been on my mind, what about when life gets super busy and noisy? Like, how do people deal with all the distractions when trying to hear God's voice?
Oh, this is such a real challenge. And I totally get it because we're living in this incredibly connected world where everything's competing for our attention. You know what I mean? Like, our phones are constantly buzzing and we've got all these responsibilities pulling us in different directions.
What are some practical ways to handle these distractions?
So, first and foremost, it's about creating these intentional boundaries. Like, maybe it's setting aside your phone for certain periods, or finding a quiet space where you can just be still. And something I've found really helpful is having a specific time each day, like early morning before the world gets crazy, you know?
What about dealing with doubt? That seems to be a big obstacle for many people.
Oh, absolutely. And doubt is actually so common that it's almost universal in our spiritual journey. The thing is, doubt isn't necessarily bad. It's like our spiritual muscles being stretched, right? But what really helps is remembering that God is so patient with us. He's not frustrated by our questions or uncertainties.
Are there specific strategies for working through those moments of doubt?
Yes, definitely. So one thing that's been really powerful for me is keeping a journal of times when God has clearly spoken or moved in my life. And when doubt creeps in, I can look back at these concrete examples and remember that God is faithful. Another really important thing is having a community of believers around you who can encourage you and share their own experiences.
That makes so much sense. What about when we feel like we're just not hearing anything at all?
You know, these seasons of silence they're actually really normal parts of our spiritual journey. Sometimes God uses these quiet periods to develop our faith and trust. The key is not to panic or think you're doing something wrong. Instead, keep showing up, keep praying, keep reading scripture, and remember that God is still present even when he seems quiet.
How do we stay consistent during those times?
So, this is where having a regular spiritual practice becomes just so crucial. Like, set aside specific times for prayer and scripture reading, even when you're not feeling it. And remember that sometimes God speaks in ways we might not expect, through serving others, through nature, through community. It's about staying open and maintaining that constant dialogue, even if it feels one-sided for a while.
Can you share some personal stories about how you've actually heard God's voice in your own life? Like specific moments that really stood out to you?
Oh yes, absolutely. So, and this is something that really changed my perspective. About 3 years ago, I was struggling with this major career decision, you know? I had this amazing job offer that looked perfect on paper, and everyone was telling me to take it. But during my prayer time, I kept feeling this persistent unease, like a gentle nudge saying, "Wait."
What happened next?
So I decided to actually listen to that quiet voice, even though it didn't make logical sense at the time. And just 2 months later, this incredible opportunity opened up at a nonprofit organization where I could use my skills to really serve others. It was like God had been preparing something so much better. You know what I mean?
Do you have any examples from, like, everyday life, something our listeners might relate to?
Oh, absolutely. So just last week, I had this really strong impression to call an old friend, and I almost talked myself out of it because, we hadn't spoken in months. But when I finally called, it turned out they were going through this really difficult time and just needed someone to talk to. It's these small promptings that show how God guides us in our daily lives.
That's really powerful. How do you know it's God's voice and not just your own thoughts?
This is something that took me time to learn. God's voice usually brings this deep sense of peace, even when it's challenging. And when it's God, the prompting usually aligns with Scripture and keeps coming back. Like this one time, I felt drawn to start a Bible study group, and even though I felt totally inadequate, there was this underlying certainty that wouldn't go away.
Can you share how that worked out?
So that Bible study group, it started with just 3 people in my living room, and now it's grown into this beautiful community of over 20 people. But the amazing thing is, it's not about the numbers, it's about how God has used it to transform lives. Like, we've had people find hope during depression, relationships restored, and even career directions clarified through our discussions and prayers together.
Those are such tangible examples. Do you have any stories about hearing God's voice in smaller, everyday decisions?
Oh yes, definitely. Like, sometimes it's as simple as feeling prompted to take a different route to work and then running into someone who needed encouragement, or getting this strong sense to buy an extra coffee, and then meeting someone who really needed that small act of kindness. It's these little moments that show how God cares about every detail of our lives.
So, after everything we've discussed today, what would you say are the key steps our listeners can take to start hearing God's voice in their daily lives?
You know what? I think the most important thing is to just start. Like, start with setting aside even just 5 minutes of quiet time each day and really create that space to listen. The key is consistency, right?
That sounds really doable when you put it that way.
Absolutely. And another practical step is to keep a journal. Write down those thoughts, those impressions that feel different from your regular thinking. And then watch how God confirms these things over time. It's like building this beautiful record of your journey with Him.
What about people who might be feeling a bit uncertain about all this?
So here's what I always tell people. Start with Scripture, because that's where we learn God's character, and it helps us recognize His voice in other areas. Remember, God is already speaking, We're just learning to tune in, like finding the right frequency on a radio.
Those are such practical steps for our Faith Fuel Freedom community.
Yes, and the most beautiful thing is, God really wants to speak to you. He's not playing hide and seek, He's waiting to connect with you in ways that are so personal and meaningful. Just take that first step, stay consistent, and watch how He shows up in your daily life.
Thank you so much for sharing all this wisdom with us today. If you enjoyed this episode, make sure to follow us for more conversations that fuel your faith journey.